It was a cold morning in the small town of Brookhaven, the kind of morning where the mist hung low over the streets, wrapping the town in an eerie silence. The police station, an old brick building with a weathered sign above the entrance, stood at the heart of the town. Officers in pressed uniforms moved in and out, their boots clicking against the pavement as they started their shifts. Inside, the scent of burnt coffee and stale paperwork lingered in the air. The station was alive with murmurs, the low hum of conversations blending with the distant chatter of a police radio. No one noticed the woman as she stepped inside. She moved with quiet confidence, her deep brown eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail. Dressed in a simple black trench coat. Her short, natural curls were neatly styled, and her face carried an air of quiet authority. But to the officers in the room, she was just another civilian, another face that did not belong. She walked toward the front desk, the sharp sound of her heels momentarily silencing the room. The officer behind the desk barely looked up. His nameplate read Officer Reynolds, and the smirk on his face showed he was in no hurry to assist her. "What do you need?" he asked, his voice laced with impatience. The woman took a slow breath. "I am here." Before she could finish, another officer brushed past her, knocking her slightly to the side as if she was invisible. He did not even bother to glance in her direction. "Watch where you're standing," he muttered under his breath. A few officers in the room chuckled. She clenched her jaw but said nothing. The air inside the station carried an unmistakable weight, an unspoken rule of who mattered and who did not. The town was small, and its ways were old. People like her were expected to know their place. Behind her, a younger officer with sharp blue eyes and a crisp uniform held a steaming cup of coffee. He leaned against the desk, throwing casual glances at his colleagues before turning his gaze toward her. His stare lingered just a second too long. "You lost, lady?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. His name tag read, Officer Matthews. The woman remained silent, her eyes steady, studying him. Matthews smirked, lifting his cup of coffee, taking a slow sip before exhaling dramatically. "You know, some people just walk into places they should not be." He took another sip, this time holding the cup dangerously close to her. She remained still. She had spent years in rooms like this, surrounded by men who underestimated her. She knew how the game was played. Matthews tilted his head, looking her up and down. "You look nervous." The tension in the room grew thick. The officers in the background exchanged knowing looks, their amusement barely hidden. The woman's fingers curled into her coat pocket, not out of fear, but out of restraint. Then, without warning, hot liquid splashed against her coat, the burning heat spreading across her chest. The room went silent. A few officers froze mid-conversation. Others turned, watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Matthews let out a short chuckle, setting his empty cup down on the counter. "Oops." The woman did not flinch. She looked down at the dark stain spreading across her coat. The scalding pain on her skin barely registered. Slowly, she lifted her gaze, her eyes locking onto Matthews. Something in her expression made the room shift. The air grew colder. The laughter that had been bubbling among the officers disappeared. Even Matthews, with all his arrogance, faltered. For a second, it was the look of a woman who had seen worse, who had survived worse. And then, she smiled. A slow, knowing smile that sent a ripple of unease through the room. She took a step forward, reaching into her coat pocket. A few officers straightened up, their hands hovering near their belts, expecting some kind of outburst. But instead, she pulled out a neatly folded paper. She held it up, allowing them all to see the bold letters at the top. Appointment letter. Chief of Police. The silence that followed was deafening. Matthews' smirk disappeared. Reynolds, the officer at the desk, swallowed hard. The others shifted uncomfortably, their amusement now replaced with something else. Disbelief. The woman let the moment stretch, savoring their stunned expressions before she spoke. "Good morning, officers," she said, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut through the tension. "I am your new boss." And just like that, the station, once so full of arrogance and unspoken rules, fell into absolute stunned silence. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The weight of realization settled over the room like a dense fog. Officer Matthews, his face draining of color, stiffened. Officer Reynolds, who had barely acknowledged her moments ago, now looked as though he wanted to melt into his chair. The other officers, those who had chuckled, those who had dismissed her, stood frozen, their expressions ranging from disbelief to barely concealed discomfort. She let the moment hang. Then, slowly, she unfolded the appointment letter and placed it on the desk in front of Reynolds. "You might want to read this carefully," she said, her voice steady. "Then make sure it reaches everyone in this department." The sound of paper sliding across the desk was the only thing that moved in the room. She turned her gaze toward Matthews, the man who had so casually thrown scalding coffee on her just minutes ago. He stood rigid now, his jaw clenched, but his eyes flickered with something else. Anger, embarrassment, fear. But the woman was used to those looks. She had seen them before, in the academy, in precincts where her presence had been an anomaly, where her uniform had not been enough to shield her from doubt. Her name was Nia Carter, and this was far from the first time she had walked into a room where she was not wanted. Brookhaven was not new to her. It had been years since she had set foot in this town, but the street still held the echoes of her childhood. The cracked sidewalks, the corner store that used to sell penny candy, the park where she had once scraped her knees. She had left this town at 18, determined never to return, but life had a way of pulling people back to the places they thought they had escaped. Her father had been an officer too, a good one. Officer Marcus Carter had been a man of integrity, the kind of officer who knew every name in the neighborhood, who believed in justice even when the system around him made it hard. He had worn the badge with pride, believing in what it stood for, long after others had stopped believing in him. She still remembered the nights he had come home exhausted, his broad shoulders heavy with disappointment. "You cannot change a broken system overnight, baby," he had once told her, sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. "But you can hold your ground. You can make them see you." She had been just a child then, watching as he forced himself to stand tall, to keep fighting, even as his department treated him as an outsider. When he had died, unexpectedly too soon, she had sworn she would never follow in his footsteps. And yet, here she was, a Carter back in Brookhaven. A Carter standing in the same station where her father had once worked, where his years of service had earned him respect among the people but hostility among his own. She had been offered this job for a reason. The department was fractured, scandals, allegations, corruption that ran deep. The mayor had wanted someone who could restore faith in the uniform, someone the town could trust. But walking in, standing in this room now, Nia knew trust was not what she saw in these men's eyes. She saw resentment, she saw defiance, and she saw something else, a challenge. "Chief Carter." A voice broke the silence. Nia turned. A woman stood near the back of the room, arms crossed. She wore a neatly pressed uniform, her badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Unlike the others, her gaze did not hold condescension, but it was not exactly welcoming either. "Sergeant Olivia Hayes." The woman introduced herself, stepping forward. Her voice was even, professional. "Welcome to Brookhaven PD." Nia met her eyes, searching. There was something calculating about Olivia, something guarded. It was clear she was measuring Nia, deciding whether she was worth respecting. Nia extended her hand. "Sergeant Hayes." Olivia hesitated only a second before shaking it. Firm grip, no nonsense. A few officers exchanged glances, as if waiting for some kind of confrontation. But Olivia said nothing more, just nodded once before stepping back. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. At least one person in this room was willing to meet her halfway. Nia turned back to Reynolds. "I assume my office is still where it was supposed to be?" Reynolds nodded stiffly. "Upstairs." She gave him a tight smile. Then I suggest you all get back to work. The tension in the room did not disappear, but the spell had been broken. Officers slowly resumed their conversations, though now their voices were lower, more measured. Matthews, still standing near the desk, had yet to move. His hands curled into fists at his sides. Nia glanced at him, tilting her head. "Something wrong, Officer Matthews?" For a moment she thought he might say something, might push back, might let whatever anger he was swallowing spill over. But then he shook his head. "No, ma'am." She held his gaze a second longer before turning toward the stairs. As she walked away, she caught the murmur of voices behind her. Officers whispering under their breath, "She won't last a month. This is a joke. Wonder if she even knows what she just walked into." Nia did not turn back. She had heard worse. She climbed the stairs, the old wood creaking beneath her boots. When she reached the office, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was cold, the air stale. Dust had settled on the desk, the chair slightly, askew as if someone had left in a hurry. She let out a slow breath. This was her space now. She moved toward the window, glancing down at the street below. Outside, the town carried on as if nothing inside this station had changed. A part of her wondered if she was making a mistake coming back here. If she was fighting a battle she could not win. Then she thought of her father. She thought of the look in his eyes on those long nights at the kitchen table. She had been a child then, unable to do anything, but she was not a child anymore. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned. Sergeant Olivia Hayes stood in the doorway, arms still crossed. But this time, there was something else in her expression. A warning. "You need to watch your back," Olivia said quietly. "You have no idea what you just walked into." Nia's fingers tightened against the edge of her desk. She already knew that much. But the way Olivia said it, the way her voice lowered just slightly, the way her eyes flickered toward the hallway as if checking for listening ears, made Nia realize something else. This was bigger than arrogance. Bigger than resentment. This department was not just broken, it was dangerous, and she had just stepped right into the fire. The weight of Olivia's words lingered in the air long after she had left the office. Nia sat at her desk, staring at the worn wooden surface, her fingers tracing invisible patterns. She already knew she was walking into a storm. She had expected resistance, had prepared herself for cold stares and whispers behind her back. But the way Olivia had said it, the way she had glanced toward the hallway as if expecting someone to be listening, made it clear that this was more than just the usual hostility toward an outsider. This was something deeper, something darker. A slow exhale left her lips as she leaned back in her chair, rubbing a hand over her face. The coffee stain on her coat had dried, but the reminder of the humiliation still burned beneath her skin. She had faced plenty of arrogance and disrespect in her career, but this was personal. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was soft, hesitant. Not the kind of knock that came from someone trying to intimidate her. "Come in," she said. The door creaked open, and a young officer stepped inside. His uniform was slightly wrinkled, and his short brown hair stuck up as if he had run his hands through it one too many times. He looked nervous. "Chief Carter," he said, standing awkwardly near the doorway. I just wanted to introduce myself. I am Officer Daniel Reed." Nia studied him for a moment. He was young, maybe mid-20s, and unlike the others, there was no contempt in his eyes, only uncertainty. She gestured toward the chair across from her desk. "Have a seat, Officer Reed." He hesitated, then stepped forward, lowering himself onto the chair. He shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasped together in his lap. "I just wanted to say..." He cleared his throat. "Not everyone in the department feels the way Matthews, and the others do." Nia's brow lifted slightly. Reed glanced toward the door, lowering his voice. "Most of the senior guys, they do not like change. They liked it better when Chief Whitaker was in charge. They knew how things worked under him." That was not a surprise. Chief Whitaker had been in power for nearly 2 decades, and from what Nia had gathered, He had ruled the department with an iron fist. Corruption and favoritism had thrived under him. Nia leaned forward slightly. "And you? How do you feel about change, Officer Reed?" Reed hesitated before answering. "I became a cop to do the right thing, but I am not going to lie. This place? It does not make that easy." There was something honest in his words, something that reminded Nia of herself when she had first started. "You came to the right place," she said. Reed nodded, but because things are about to change. Another pause. Then, with a quick glance toward the hallway, he leaned forward and whispered, "You should be careful. Matthews is not just some arrogant jerk. He has friends in high places." Nia's jaw tightened. She had expected Matthews to be a problem, but the way Reed said it, with real fear in his eyes, told her that this was more than just an ego-driven officer trying to push her out. There was something bigger at play. Reed straightened in his chair, as if realizing he had already said too much. "I should go. Just watch your back, Chief." With that, he stood up and left the office. The moment he was gone, Nia exhaled slowly, her mind working through the pieces of the puzzle. She had only been here a few hours, and already, she could feel the undercurrents of something sinister running through this department. She was going to have to dig deep. That afternoon, as she stepped out of the station to get some air, she noticed the whispering had grown louder, the glances more pointed. Officers barely moved aside as she walked past. When she reached the parking lot, she stopped cold. Her car, her personal vehicle, was sitting in its assigned spot. But the windows were smashed in and the words "Leave" were spray-painted in bright red across the driver's side door. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to remain calm. She heard footsteps behind her. "You are making enemies fast." Nia turned to find Olivia standing a few feet away, arms crossed. She gestured toward the car. "You see this?" Olivia's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yeah, I see it." Nia studied her. "You going to tell me you do not know who did it?" Olivia sighed, shaking her head. "I could guess, but you already know the answer. Matthews. Or someone close to him." Nia took a slow breath, forcing herself to think. The old her, the rookie version of herself who had once let anger dictate her actions, would have gone inside, slammed her fists on the desk, demanded answers. But that was not who she was now. Now she knew that real battles are won with strategy. She turned to Olivia. "Let me guess, no cameras in the lot?" Olivia's silence was confirmation enough. Of course. This was a message. A warning. But Nia had never been the kind of woman to back down from a fight. As she stood there, staring at the vandalized car, a memory surfaced. She was 10 years old, sitting on the front steps of her house, knees scraped from falling off her bike. Tears burned her eyes, frustration bubbling in her chest. Her father had come out, his uniform still on, exhaustion heavy in his posture. But when he saw her, he crouched down, studying her scraped knees. "You hurt?" he had asked. She sniffled. "Yeah." Her father had nodded. "You gonna let that stop you from riding again?" She had frowned, shaking her head. A small smile tugged at his lips. "Good. Because the world is going to knock you down 100 times, baby girl. It is going to push you, shove you, try to make you quit. But you do not quit." She had wiped at her face stubbornly. "What if it hurts?" Her father had placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip warm, steady. "Then you get back up anyway." Now, standing in the parking lot with officers watching from the windows, waiting to see how she would react, she straightened her shoulders. She would not give them the reaction they wanted. She would not let them see weakness. She turned to Olivia. "Get someone to document this." Olivia's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something close to approval flashing in her eyes. "On it," she said. Nia turned and walked back into the station, her steps steady, her heart pounding. If they thought this was enough to scare her away, they were dead wrong. But what she did not know was that this was only the beginning. And the real danger It was still waiting in the shadows.